The ThinkPad P1 is a laptop that I have been interested in reviewing for a little over a year now because it's a premium, thin and light, high performance 15-inch laptop with its own unique set of strengths and weaknesses. And that's important because there's no laptop that does everything better than every other laptop. There's no perfect laptop, and everybody has their own personal preferences and use cases, which makes everything subjective. Which means if you can make like an overall good laptop with one or two things that it does exceedingly well that no other laptop in its class offers, for a certain group of people, you've just made their perfect laptop. For example, an author is not going to benefit from an RTX 2080, but they will benefit from a good keyboard. So we're going to go through this laptop, talk about what it excels at, who should buy this, and a quick discussion about the ThinkPad X1 Extreme. Regarding the build of the device, this is probably my favorite build of any laptop. In terms of strength and structural rigidity, it's fairly well built, but not the best that I've seen. The screen has a little bit of flex, same with the keyboard deck. The screen is technically a one-hand open. It's a little bit on the stiffer side, but unfortunately, there is quite a bit of screen wobble, which you should consider if you are a touchscreen user. I also tested the screen wobble when using this thing on my lap, but it doesn't really wobble, and I didn't notice anything worth mentioning, so it's really only an issue if you actually poke the screen. But the reason I like this so much, despite those criticisms, is because of the finish. There's this neat carbon fiber finish on the top of the laptop, matte black everywhere else, and they also have this very subtle, soft touch finish that also does an excellent job at hiding oils and fingerprints. That's a pretty common issue with a lot of black gaming laptops, like for example the Razer Blade 15, but the way they implemented it here makes this more comfortable, and the fact that it doesn't look like a greasy mess is just like a bonus on top. One of the things that ThinkPads are known for are their keyboards, and rather than characterizing the typing experience objectively, I think what I'm going to do is compare it against a few other popular laptops to try and give you a better idea of what it feels like. It has similar key travel to the Surface Laptop 3, the 2015 and older MacBook Pros, and the Alienware M15. Coincidentally, I also think these four keyboards are some of the nicest that I've personally used. With a lot of the laptops that I review, generally I can hit around 105 words per minute. There aren't many laptops above $800 that negatively impact my typing speed to a significant degree. But in terms of comfort and typing experience, this is where the ThinkPad and those three other laptops that I mentioned excel. This is a very comfortable keyboard to type on, especially for long typing sessions, like if you're writing an essay or if you're an author. If you're upgrading from a 2015 MacBook Pro and you want to keep that typing experience, this is very similar, if not identical. The last thing that I want to mention is the Surface Laptop 3. I don't think these are really comparable because that has a very sharp tactile bump, whereas this has a more rounded bump. It's not quite as intense, and some people might prefer that softer and more comfortable typing experience. By default, the bottom left key is function rather than control, but you can swap them in the BIOS or the Lenovo Vantage software, and to the right of the keyboard is a fingerprint sensor. Next is the trackpad and the track point. Regarding the trackpad, the Surface has this soft touch finish, just like the rest of the interior. Kind of feels like silicone, and it's very smooth. The tracking accuracy and acceleration curve are both good, and the button clicks are both softer and quieter than something like the Surface Laptop or the XPS 15. Not as soft or as quiet as the Blade 15, it's pretty much right in between. I like it. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time for me to really learn how to use the track point because not having to move your entire hand down to the trackpad to move your cursor is something that I value quite a bit. There just wasn't enough time for me to spend on this laptop because of all the other laptops that I was reviewing before this. But from my relatively brief experience, I think once you get used to the track point and you're able to accurately and quickly move the cursor around, it can be a lot more comfortable than using a trackpad. But if you're making a lot of fast movements, I think I prefer the trackpad or even the touchscreen because you can move the cursor across the screen in an instant. If you don't like the track point, you can disable it if you want. But I think that, the track point, along with a good trackpad and the option for a touchscreen, makes this thing very versatile. I think they all excel at different use cases, and the track point never really got in my way when typing, so I like having these options even though the trackpad was what I primarily used. They have a configurator on their website with 4 different screen options. I would personally go for the 1080p HDR screen because you get better battery life compared to the 4K panel. It's rated at 500 nits, it supports HDR, uses a matte coating, and it's like a $30 option from the base model, so it happens to be the best value of the four. I personally measured mine to be a little bit under the rated 400 nits in terms of brightness, but still very comfortable indoors. The color accuracy on this is quite poor, which seems to come from the inconsistent gamma curve, which if you don't know what that means, basically it's because OLED inherently has less than ideal color accuracy. For casual use, it is a nice screen, but does not measure particularly well for content creation in 2020. The higher brightness of the 1080p screen is what I would consider particularly good, and bright screens just look more vibrant to me, so the 1080p HDR screen is probably what I would recommend as the ideal choice for most people. The speakers are mounted on the bottom, and by default they come tuned using the Dolby Atmos app. They sound decent, much better than if you disabled the EQ profile. Without any tuning, they sound really hollow, so they crank up the bass quite heavily to compensate, but in doing so, you inherently muffle the vocals and the other instruments. I would say they sound more enjoyable than the XPS 15 because of that low end, but not as clear and detailed. Port selection on this is pretty good, I would say. On the left, you have the proprietary charging port, 2 Thunderbolt 3s, HDMI 2.0, a strange looking Ethernet port, a headphone jack, and on the right, you have 2 more USB-As and a full-size SD slot. I like the full-size SD slot, I think it's cool. Opening up the laptop is super easy. They use a couple Phillips head screws and you have access to 2 RAM slots, 2 M.2 slots, and the Wi-Fi card. It's running the Intel AX200 for Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.1, so you shouldn't need to replace it. And they even let you specifically configure the RAM in single or dual channel, how much storage you want in each M.2 slot, and whether you want to configure the 2 drives in RAID from the factory. Funnily enough, if you look at the spec sheet of this thing, the fastest CPU this thing can be configured with is the Consumer Core i9 9880H. If you go for the Xeon, you're limited to a 6-core CPU, but that's going to be required if you want ECC memory. My unit is configured with a Xeon and 32 gigs of ECC memory in single channel, as well as a Quadro T2000. It's roughly on par with a Core i7 9750H and a GTX 1650 Ti, right in line with the XPS 15. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any benchmarks or workloads that really benefit from Xeons or Quadros, but when it comes to desktop Xeons, generally speaking, they are locked, they run at lower clock speeds for stability, they lack integrated graphics, and they have support for stuff like AVX 512, which, at like a very basic level, modern Intel and AMD CPUs can usually, with exceptions, only process 64 bits or 8 bytes of data in a single instruction. But AVX 512 lets it process 512 bits or 64 bytes in a single instruction, giving you much better performance in certain workloads. Just check out this graph, for example. AMD's 32-core Threadripper more than doubles Intel's 16-core CPU without AVX 512, but that 16-core CPU more than doubles the 32-core Threadripper once you run it with AVX 512. That is not supported in this mobile Xeon, and it also has integrated graphics for better battery life. And that is why I'm not really sure where this mobile Xeon sits. Same thing with the Quadros. I think Linus tested a couple of Quadros before and there was no performance improvement compared to the GeForce cards, and that its main benefit was the higher amounts of VRAM. Both the Quadro T1000 and the T2000 here only have 4 gigs of VRAM, unlike some of the higher end Quadro RTX cards. The top end model actually has 24 gigs of it. Anyway, all that to say, I've got no clue what workloads these particular Xeons and Quadros are geared for because they don't have the same benefits as their desktop variants. Again, if you need ECC memory, you're going to need the Xeon, but other than that, I think most people are going to be better off with the 8-core i9. I'm going to throw up some gaming benchmarks anyway, just because I'd rather show something rather than nothing, but I am aware that gaming is not what Xeons and Quadros were made for. It will work, and it does a reasonably good job if you just want to unwind and play some video games after a long day of work, but newer games will require the settings dialed down to medium to maintain 60 FPS. Thermals on this aren't great, and I think part of that is due to the fan curve because it doesn't really get that loud. Unfortunately, it does not have manual fan control. Same with the XPS 15. You only get these like thermal profiles, which in my experience doesn't seem to make much of a difference in terms of fan speed or thermals. Surface temperatures are great, it never really got uncomfortable, and I'm guessing a part of that is due to the soft touch finish. It's not as thermally conductive as aluminum. There's an 80 watt-hour battery inside, which is more typical of a gaming laptop than the 16-inch MacBook Pro or the XPS 15, both with roughly 100 watt-hour batteries. I'm getting around 5.5 hours of light use, but you will get better battery life with the 1080p model. I just can't say how much more because I don't have one to test. And as an added bonus, something that I haven't seen with many other laptops, this thing also supports fast charging, so you can go from 0 to 50% in about half an hour. So you can just plug it in while you're having lunch, and it should last you the rest of the day. If you're looking for a work-oriented laptop similar to the XPS 15, I think this is the best implementation that I've seen so far. It's got excellent build quality, keyboard, and upgradability. Regardless of what your use case is, I think everyone can benefit from a great keyboard, and the expandability is really nice for enthusiasts or just anyone that happens to need a lot of memory or a lot of storage. Video editors would be a prime example of this. And my only real complaints with this is the lack of manual fan control and the thermals. With a stronger chassis, better speakers, the option for USB-C charging, and a larger 100 watt-hour battery to really solidify this thing as an all-around excellent laptop. Now regarding the price, it starts at $1,675 for a really low-end configuration, but remember how I said that the Xeon and the Quadro here don't really have the same benefits as their desktop counterparts? Well, if you go with the X1 Extreme, it's basically like a consumer version of the P1. That thing starts at $1,475 with a GTX 1650 Max-Q included. Then you upgrade the CPU to the i7 and you get the 1080p HDR screen. And now you're at $1,600. You upgrade the memory and storage yourself. It's cheaper that way. And now you've got a really good all-around laptop. Compared to an XPS 15 9500, the X1 Extreme is $150 cheaper at that recommended configuration. It's got a better keyboard and upgradability, but it doesn't have a full day battery like the XPS 15. That's really the differentiating factor between the two. Everything else, in my opinion, is relatively minor. They should be updating these soon with new CPUs. I don't know when, but hopefully it won't take too long. And yeah, that is the end of this video. For some reason, they've been getting progressively longer, so I hope you still enjoyed it. I mean, half this video was gameplay footage because I'm too lazy to record actual B-roll. I'm also hoping to show off my website soon as well. Very exciting, very hot, and I'll see you next time.